In the last lecture in this course, we are going to be talking about ecosystems and terrestrial biomes. And like soils that we talked about last time, ecosystems are important because they help us to integrate information from across the course. This is a way we can tie everything together. And also, like soils, they face really important threats in the future. So just having a basic understanding of ecosystems, just like you hopefully gained a basic understanding of soils, you can appreciate why things like changing climates or the overuse of soils or ecosystems by humans have all sorts of ripple systems that ripple effects that we might not really think about. In order to understand ecosystems and terrestrial biomes, it's first of all important to understand the idea that any ecosystem has abiotic components that are put into it. These are things we've already talked about in this course: insulation, sunlight, right? Water that comes from precipitation and climate, and the gases and the minerals that are naturally in the landscape. The biotic components of any ecosystem start with the so-called producers. These are plants that capture the sun's energy. They grow, they build mass, and are then consumed by animals that then also consume each other. Both the producers and the consumers eventually die, and the decomposers help to recycle that energy back into the atmosphere, and the minerals that were used by the producers and consumers back into the ecosystem itself. Now, in this course, we're not going to talk a great deal about that trophic system, as it's referred to, but we are going to talk a little bit about the idea that the abiotic components limit what can happen in an ecosystem. We know that sunlight varies across the planet for different reasons at different seasons. We know temperatures are different. We know that the amount of water that's available varies depending on what the climate is like. And as a result of that, the soil changes and its chemistry changes. These sorts of things limit what can grow and what can't grow at what time of year. And as a result of this, the major terrestrial biomes have the major producers in them that are adapted evolutionarily to address these limits. They effectively have strategies that allow them to be adapted. Think, for example, about what happens even in South Central Alaska as you move your way up in elevation. The amount of sunlight stays about the same probably, but the temperature decreases, of course, and water availability changes because we have colder temperatures up high, which means more snow and ice. As a result of that, we have different chemistry in the soil, we have different soil formation processes, and ultimately we have different types of ecosystems or terrestrial biomes that are growing in those areas. And the diagram here sort of shows this idea of a vertical zonation that occurs, although it starts with a tropical rainforest as opposed to the types of forests that we have. So we're going to talk now about some of the Earth's terrestrial biomes, and each time we come to a new biome, we'll talk a little bit about how the major producers in that biome are adapted to whatever the limiting features are, if there are limiting features. Tropical rainforests, we know, don't have much in the way of limiting features in terms of sunlight or moisture. Lots and lots of opportunity for that. So their biomass is very productive. These are the world's most productive terrestrial biomes. They do, however, have relatively poor soils as a result of lateralization and the formation of those oxasols that we talked about before. So one of the adaptations that the big producers have is to have buttress trees, meaning that the trunks of the trees have these big buttresses in them, as you can see right here, so that they can spread their root systems across horizontally the forest and don't have to go deep into the soil where there's not a lot of nutrient. That allows them to capture that nutrition that comes from organic material that dies and decomposes very quickly, as much as they possibly can. Within the forest itself, there is what is called storied vegetation. Lots of different plants adapted to capturing as much sunlight and moisture as they possibly can, oftentimes in these effective layers within the forest. In addition, there are a lot of species that grow literally in and on the trees, arboreal species, rather than growing down low where there isn't a lot of nutrient. Now, tropical rainforests can be contrasted to what happens when we start to move our way north or south of the equator. There's still plentiful insolation, but the rainfall starts to become seasonal because you have tropical savanna climates. And as a result of that, you can't have as much biomass. There tends to be more fire during the winter when things are relatively dry. The soil regimes still are relatively lateralized, generally speaking, so they're not great. The types of plants have to change as well. They have to adapt to these new conditions. And what happens initially when you move away from the tropical rainforest is you still have tropical forests, but they tend to be much scrubbier. The plants tend to have a lot of thorns on them, or so-called Dornveld forests. They're often semi-deciduous trees as well, which means that during the dry season, they lose their leaves or their leaves change dramatically. Sometimes the leaves of trees are protected with very waxy material, or the bark has a gum material that keeps it from drying out too much. These trees tend to be very different from what you get in the tropical forests themselves. As we get further and further away from the tropical rainforest climates, we start to get very different conditions. And eventually we get to grassland-like areas, usually with some scrub in it, but the forests and trees aren't particularly large. The soil regimes are mixed here and start to have some degree of calcification in them because the winters are so dry often. As a result of this, grasses tend to do better. They're better adapted to fire. Many of the plants are what are called xerophytic, which means they're adapted to very dry conditions. They have very small leaves, or they're very thick leaves, or waxy leaves, again, that keeps the amount of transpiration down, which is the water that a plant loses during a dry season. Big, large land mammals are very well adapted to these areas. The ungulates are, and the consumers that hunt the ungulates are, because there are lots of grasses in this area, and there's a lot of browsing that can take place. Those are the major tropical biomes. Let's move to the cooler climates, the northern climates, the places where we find mesothermal and microthermal climates. These are places now we know that have really profound seasonal fluctuation in insolation. So during the winter time, not very much light at all. In fact, many of these areas see freezing periods, which limits the amount of moisture that's available as well. So what do trees do? In these conditions, during the winter time, they lose their leaves, and then they regrow them, oftentimes with great big canopies, as you can see in these really large trees found here in the American South and the American Mid-Atlantic. The soils in these areas are generally fairly good, alpha sols, utasols, mollisols as well. So they're able to have much larger root systems that can go a lot deeper, and their trunks aren't as buttressed as you find in the tropical areas. So sometimes you do get those, especially when you have more of the utasolic type soils in an area. Once we get even farther north into those microthermal climates, we have an even bigger fluctuation. So the big trees that we see become even more deciduous. They become much smaller, like birch trees. But many of the trees that survive actually keep their leaves all winter, which might seem sort of strange now that you've thought about it a little bit. And these are the boreal forests. The boreal forests, and also forests that are found high in the mountains as well, have trees that keep their leaves, but their leaves are very tiny. Like a needle is actually a leaf. You might not think of it as one, but the needle is a leaf that's retained all year round. It is very resistant to losing moisture, though, during the winter when there's not a lot of available moisture. And they keep their needles on so that as soon as conditions start to get warmer, there's more sunlight, and there's available moisture, growing can take place right away. If a lot of the boreal forests theoretically, waited for available moisture and sunlight, they wouldn't have time to grow a leaf canopy, and so this helps to maximize that strategy. Soils tend to be relatively poor. We know in many parts of Alaska, you don't have a lot of really deep root systems in trees. Instead, they spread out a great deal for both the deciduous and for the coniferous trees. When we're in the west coast areas of the mesothermal climates, that's where we get the marine west coast climates. These are places with lots and lots of precipitation. Think southeast Alaska or the Pacific Northwest. They still get seasonal insolation, but things don't freeze up as much, and so there's available moisture all year round, and as a result, you get some pretty big trees with a lot of vegetation and biomass that's produced. So the temperate rainforests aren't quite as productive as tropical rainforests, but they're still quite productive. The soils tend to be a little bit better as well. They tend to have more alpha sols in these areas, although sometimes they're spotosolic. You get that same vertical structure that you had in the tropical areas, but different species adapted in different ways. As we move our way down south from those areas, we get to the Mediterranean areas. And in the Mediterranean areas, you definitely get forested areas, but it tends to be a lot shrubbier and scrubbier. And that's because in the winter, the growing season is decent, but not as much sunlight as you would want. And in the summer, it's arid. It's almost desert-like, as we saw from some of the climographs where we looked at Mediterranean climates. There's often calcification in the soils, and alpha sols are very common, but areas also run the risk of salinization too. So that dryness can be good, but it can slip into bad as well. The strategies that are used to adapt to these sorts of conditions include what are called the hard-leafed shrubs or sclerophyllous shrubs, chaparral, it's sometimes known as well, very fire-adapted, very hard, tough plants essentially. The fruits that grow in this area tend to have really thick skins like olives and lemons, as you can see right here. And here's a picture that sort of shows the shrub in a more classic Mediterranean area. Once we moved into the steppe climates, we start to move into the true grassland areas. These are places where there are arid conditions with really large summer moisture deficits. Very difficult for big trees to grow, except along waterways where there's a lot of available moisture. But the good news is calcification is very strong. And so the grasses that are adapted to growing in these areas have extremely well-developed root systems. They produce sod. Right? These are some of the big grassland areas, and that's why cereal grains do so well, making these the bread baskets of the world. You get large grazing animals, like you did in the wet, dry savanna climates, because these big ungulates are able to take advantage of the grassy areas, though they are, of course, hunted by consumers. Once we get to the desert areas where there's very little moisture all year round, we have these xerophytic plants taking over. In addition to xerophytic plants with big root systems that spread out to capture water and very small waxy leaves, we also have things like ephemeral plants, plants that only appear right after a rain. Even though those rains may not come every year, they're adapted to survive from year to year until their moment comes. Or we have interesting plants like cacti that are able to store water. So these are more adaptations that are found both in warm and in cold areas, though of course they're quite different one from another. And then the final terrestrial biome to talk about are the Arctic and alpine tundra biomes, where we have very limited growing seasons, not only because there isn't a lot of sunlight, but often because there's not a lot of available moisture. And when the moisture does come, especially if there's permafrost in the area, there's this active zone that makes it very difficult to grow. Too much moisture, sort of waterlogged areas, and oftentimes this sorting that takes place and glycation that takes place in the soils that make the soils relatively poor. So the plants that grow tend to be very slow growing, very low to the ground, various different types of herbaceous plants. So these are all the key biomes, and hopefully you're able to think a little bit about the different strategies they employ as everything finishes up here.